Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of myself, as President of this association, and Lord Ribeiro, I'd like to welcome you to this symposium on the Mid-Staffordshire NHS Foundation Trust Public Inquiry. It scarcely is necessary to have a preamble. There's been no bigger event in UK medicine in recent years than the problem that arose at the Mid-Staffs Foundation Trust. There are very uncomfortable facts that affect the surgical profession and medicine in general. And as an association, we believed our best approach was to highlight the problem at this Congress, and that would enable a coherent response from surgery as a whole. We have a distinguished set of speakers for this afternoon, and I'd propose to move straight on and introduce Robert Francis, QC. He needs little introduction. His name has been in the media for some considerable time. He's a distinguished barrister, having been called to the bar in 1972. His extensive experience in medical negligence matters and related inquiries, and including the present Mid-Staffs inquiry. Robert Francis, thank you.
Well, thank you very much for those kind words. I approached this podium with some hesitation after the last highly inspirational session, which dealt with the enormous good that can be done by the medical profession, the tremendous skill that can be brought to bear, the dedication of those who undertake that work. And it's my uncomfortable task now to turn to a darker side of what can happen when professionalism is not applied, when the patient is forgotten. I was asked to undertake not one but two inquiries into the affairs of Mid-Staffordshire. And indeed, including those, a total of 6 inquiries have taken place around that hospital. And it is important, I think, that we listen and consider what can be done now. But can I just first of all, as part of the process, introduce you a little bit to the report and to some of the things that we found. Is that the right one? No. Let's find something that works to... Sorry. Can you tell me what I'm going to press to change the slide?
Mouse.
Hmm? Is it this one? No? Yeah, that's okay.
Forward.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Despite the fact that there have been that number of inquiries, there is a significant group of people, including a significant part of the population of Stafford, that consider that the whole matter is exaggerated. In the course of the inquiry, the former chair of the Staffordshire Trust, who had been chair at the time of the events we were looking at, said this, that she thought that it was more likely that the reason a huge number of people didn't find anything uniquely dreadful is that there was nothing uniquely dreadful to find out. That was her view, honestly expressed, about what was happening at Mid-Staffordshire. Those that think like that, in my respectful opinion, should actually look particularly at Volume 2 of the first report, which collated together the accounts of 900 people who voluntarily approached my inquiry. And of those, well over 600 had tales to tell, some of which would make your blood curdle, and some of which I will in due course share with you. The other question that I'm often asked is whether what we found just occurs in Stafford. Taking this passage from the same witness, it might be thought the answer to that is no, there are likely to be others out there. She thought, that what was happening in Stafford, or was described by the witnesses to the inquiry, was something that you could find in many other places, and that the reaction she'd got from many colleagues had been that but for the grace of God go we. I don't know for certain whether there is another Stafford elsewhere in the country, but what concerns me is that I'm not sure anyone does. The system of regulation and oversight and dare I say, of governance in many trusts is not such as to uncover episodes of appalling care, such as were found in Stafford. Get this right in a moment. Who, however, is important? These patients are important. This picture shows you some members of Cure the NHS, who are largely relatives, sometimes patients, who witnessed terrible things happening in their hospital. They individually made complaints about that and were not over-impressed by the reaction they got to those complaints. They didn't believe that what they had seen going wrong was being put right. So they banded together into an organisation called Cure the NHS and started to make a noise. If it hadn't been for them, none of these problems would have come to the fore. And it is a sad commentary, it seems to me, on the system which was meant to be serving people like this, that it took a huge amount of courage and effort and a sacrifice of the quality of life of these people in order to bring this matter to the attention, to give some chance of something being done about it. The cost to them has been quite considerable. Julie Bailey, who you see in this picture here, has been the subject of quite considerable local abuse. She was the subject of an expressed wish by an ambulance driver on Facebook that she should get a terminal disease and see what it was like getting into an ambulance and not being able to go to her local hospital. The latest news about that ambulance driver, as of yesterday, was that he's just been dismissed by the ambulance trust. But her mother's grave has been desecrated. She has been spat at in the street. And it seems to me that we can't ignore the fact that even when quite substantial evidence is forthcoming that poor care is being delivered, there will be those who refuse to believe it. And I think that's a measure of the trust with which the public, in which the public holds not only the medical profession, but also the NHS. And it's a trust which can be, I'm afraid, easily abused. One of the things that I'll talk about in a moment is the need to put out honest information which actually informs the public in a balanced way what is going on in our hospitals and in healthcare generally, so they can make a balanced judgment about it as well. Now, what went wrong in Stafford and why wasn't it found out? Well, the simple answer to the last question is that people who were in a position to know must have ignored things that they were being told. This is an extract from a report prepared after the death of a patient in April 2007. The patient was an insulin-dependent diabetic, an elderly lady, who was admitted to hospital because she'd broken her leg. She was in hospital for 11 days and went through 3 wards. On her admission, it was recorded that she was an insulin-dependent diabetic. A prescription for insulin was written up. There were instructions given that she should be seen by a dietitian. 11 days later, and 3 wards later, she died because she hadn't been given insulin. For good measure, she hadn't been seen by a dietitian, and just as a bonus, she contracted Clostridium difficile in the hospital. The in-house solicitor for the trust investigated the matter and produced a report, of which this is an extract, and found these things wrong. To be fair, the final one in the list was probably factually wrong. But one might have thought that anyone reading that report would consider there was serious cause for concern. Indeed, the report itself said that these failures were not likely to be an isolated incident, and it was clear from talking to the staff and looking at records that other similar issues were occurring regularly. However, that report was never seen by the hospital board, which adopted an attitude that matters like this were operational and not strategic, and therefore were not matters to be considered by it. An awful lot, it seems to me, can be learnt, not from figures, which maybe have their use, but actually from the individual accounts in complaints given by individuals about what they have observed. This was the evidence of a daughter of a patient about that very common complaint, buzzers being ignored. In fact, it's a complaint that's heard so often, the impact on that is, I think, sometimes lost. This description, I think, puts that right. It tells you that in a ward where buzzers are being ignored, people suffer. They wet their beds, they despair, they suffer huge distress, and then they give up by that being indicated by them going quiet. But what else does it tell you? It tells you that it's not just a case of one patient being ignored because a busy nurse went on to look at another patient. It means that there is a whole group of patients in a ward being ignored, and the risk that incurs is, of course, immeasurable. Why is the buzzer going? It might be something trivial. It might not. Until a nurse investigates, no one is going to know. And then you get cases like this, which are frank abuse of a vulnerable patient. A 96-year-old lady who's left with no clothes on, with the door to her room open so everyone going past can see her. She is covered in feces in her eyes, her nails, her hands, and on the cot side. And it was dried, so it had obviously been there a long time. What does a story like that tell anyone looking at it about the system being run in the hospital? Clearly, I would suggest there is something serious that needs to be done in such an institution. So there were, we found, a great number of warning signs, and this is a list of some of them. But in addition to warning signs, what we also have to be aware of is silence, because a large number of people who are in our hospitals can't speak for themselves, and they often don't have anyone who can speak for them. And this was just an account given by a family who were asked to help feed their elderly relative. Nothing particularly wrong in that, I suppose. But what they were worried about was that they were having to help feed other patients in the ward who didn't seem to have anyone to help them. Who is going to look after the interests of such patients? I would suggest that it has to be, in the first instance, the nurses and doctors who are in the ward who must pay, I would suggest, particular attention to patients who cannot speak for themselves. But there are other barriers to finding out what's going on in a hospital. One of them is fear. It is an unhappy fact that many people who go into hospital and their relatives and their supporters are afraid to raise concerns because they're afraid that the treatment will actually get worse out of spite rather than better. And it doesn't actually matter whether that fear is justified in a hospital or not. If it's there, it will actually stop valuable information coming out to enable better care to be given to patients. But some people are also intimidated. Indeed, I would suggest most of us, if we go into hospital for care, we suddenly feel helpless. We are afraid. We do not wish to make a fuss. And then there are those who are put off by thoughtless behaviour on the part of staff, like the nurse here who said, "Don't moan." All that very British perhaps I should say in Scotland, that very English of characteristics, which is not to want to be a nuisance, because no doubt the people around you have better things to do. One source of information about concerns which has perhaps been overlooked too much in the past are trainees. Trainees to the medical profession, generally speaking, are keen, idealistic, not tainted by the cynicism and the weariness that overcomes many people as they go through life. And they can see poor care and understand that it is them. This doctor, a senior registrar at the time in emergency medicine, came to the A&E department and considered it to be an absolute disaster. And the things that he found wrong included lack of nursing staff, lack of leadership, and bullying of nurses, of other people, in order to reach the target. He did not remain quiet. He spoke to his clinical supervisor. He got no response. He spoke to his consultant, who was full of resignation and felt there wasn't anything that could be done. He raised the matter at a session of the College of Emergency Medicine. Everyone sympathised, but no one suggested anything he could do. And finally, the Healthcare Commission actually being on the premises by this time for an investigation, he went to them. Also, to be fair, he filled in a survey form for the deanery in which he said the place was a catastrophe, he had no training opportunities, and he would never recommend any of his friends to go there. And to be fair, the deanery did start looking into the matter. But I think that much greater opportunities should be given to trainees who should be made to feel safe about the raising of concerns. There is, however, a cost involved in raising concerns. This nurse was a whistleblower. She complained that the two sisters in the accident and emergency department were pressurising other sisters to fabricate discharge times in the medical records so that the department would meet the waiting time target. The two sisters were at least temporarily moved out of the ward, and the result was that she was victimised and harassed by those nurses' colleagues to the extent that she feared for her physical safety and felt it necessary to have relatives to come to pick her up at night because she was afraid to cross the car park in the dark. It seems to me that however much we have policies and laws about whistleblowing and protecting them, actually the only thing that's going to work is for a culture to develop within a hospital amongst the staff that actually stamps out this sort of unacceptable behaviour. Working in a bad environment where bad things are allowed to happen and are tolerated has a very unfortunate effect on the staff, high and low. As the whistleblowing doctor in A&E, the one I've just mentioned, put it, if you're in that environment for long enough, what happens is you become immune to the sound of pain. You either become immune to the sound of pain or you walk away. You cannot feel other people's pain. And that leads, I'm afraid, to this. This evidence was given by a senior consultant, a physician, it has to be said, who had been chair of the consultants committee. And what he was talking about here was a concern the surgeons had about a ward reconfiguration that everyone agreed was a disaster. They raised concerns about it, but when initially they were ignored, in effect they shrugged their shoulders and got on with it. We will have to make mend and do. And one has to ask oneself whether that is, in this day and age, an acceptable point of view for a professional senior doctor to take. Why do they? Well, the answer was given by another senior consultant, soon to retire. He said, this is in evidence on oath, that he accepted he should have been more forceful in the statements that he had made. But he didn't have a managerial role, and therefore he didn't see himself as someone who needed to get involved. Perhaps my conscience, he said, may have made me raise concerns if I'd been in a management role, but I took the path of least resistance. Most of my patients were day cases, and there was less impact on them. There were also veiled threats that I shouldn't rock the boat at my stage in life because, for example, I needed discretionary points or to be put forward for clinical excellence awards. Now, very laudable though this candour is, the attitude and mind it displays is alarming, but I fear that it may reflect a reality amongst a wider group of people than it's comfortable to admit. The college that many of you will belong to visited Stafford on 2 occasions as part of an invited review mechanism. The first was in 2007, and it declared in a report, the report declared, that the department was, quote, somewhat dysfunctional. One of the things that was happening there was that a group, well, 2 surgeons in particular, were refusing to talk to each other to the extent that they refused to agree standard procedures for particular operations, to the extent that the operating theatre staff didn't know what equipment to put out for the operations. That clearly was not safe. The report warned that unless all this was addressed urgently, the unit will disintegrate further and the situation may become irredeemable. Cutting a very long story short, the only action that occurred as a result of this report taken by the Trust was to send the 2 consultants off for psychological counselling. And the only thing they both agreed when giving evidence to one of my inquiries was that that was totally useless. That might be somewhat comic, until one comes to the fact that in 2009, the Royal College was asked to send a team in again. To be fair, by this time it was known the place was in an awful mess because the Healthcare Commission had already reported. But on this occasion, they discovered there was poor judgment and decision-making. There was grossly negligent care uncovered by them. The division was said to be dangerous, and immediate action was required. It was described to the inquiry as being one of the most outspoken Royal College of Surgeons reports that had ever been produced. Sadly, amongst the things they uncovered was a case involving a surgeon who, despite a multidisciplinary team opinion that a patient was unfit for surgery, without reconsulting that team, went ahead with surgery, as a result of which a patient died on the operating table. Well, who makes a difference in the NHS? I won't quiz you as to who all these people are, but do any of these people make a difference? In the course of my 3.5 years being involved in the affairs of Stafford, I've had the privilege of meeting 3 Secretaries of State, 2 permanent secretaries in charge of the department, 3 chairs and 2 chief executives of the Care Quality Commission, 3 chief executives of the trust concerned. Regulators have come and gone, and so one might add have inquiries. The lack of stability and cohesion in the organisation of the NHS must, I suggest, be a factor in making it a less than the safe place that it ought to be for patients. So we come to my recommendations, which I think was the billing about what I was going to talk about. 290 with about 3 minutes to talk about them in. Why did I make 290 recommendations? Well, the reason was I had a choice. Either I could have gone down the route of temptation and recommended another reorganisation, a moving of deck chairs, or I could do something rather more complicated, which was to set out, as it were, a list of things that needed to be done in various parts, indeed all parts of the system, top to bottom, from one side of it to the other, which all people involved in the system could have something to do with. Because it's only like that, it seems to me, that you change a culture. And what we need is a safety culture, a patient-centred culture, which will survive any form of reorganisation our government, our politicians decide to impose on the system. That's not to say those reorganisations are wrong or right. I don't want to enter into that debate. But what must survive through them all is the priority to be given to the patient and the need to treat them in safety. And the list I put up on the screen, it seems to be the themes that link all these 290 recommendations together. Now, I'm often asked, is there just one of these that would make the difference? And the answer is no. I'm not so proprietorial about these things that I think that everything needs to be done, without which there'll be a disaster. But if these objectives are not achieved, then I believe there will be a disaster. We do need to reassert the common values of the NHS, particularly as the bits of it disperse somewhat. We need to remind ourselves in the busy, under the pressures of the day, of finance, targets and all the rest of it, that the whole purpose of the exercise is to look after patients. Therefore, they must be put first, and everyone in the system must be reminded of that on a constant basis. The NHS has a bit of a habit of waiting to be told what to do. And I believe there's much that we just uncovered which can be remedied right now by everyone in this room and everyone in who I've addressed in the now 22 talks I've given on this subject since February. The commitment speaks for itself. A commitment to actually agreeing the standard procedures that those surgeons in Stafford found it so difficult to put together. That really ought to become absolutely essential. The reporting of concerns needs to be encouraged and welcomed. There are fundamental standards, whether they're defined by regulation or not, compliance with which really should be universal and breach of which should not be tolerated by anyone who has anything to do with them. And this is my short list. Of course, there are many others. As I've already said, I think we can encourage trainees to do a great deal more. And I'm afraid consultants, and I imagine many of you in this room are consultants, have an important role to play in that. Can I please ask you that when a trainee approaches you with a concern, even if you think it's misguided, welcome it. Do not let that individual go away thinking they've done something wrong or that nothing will happen. There are two things to do with a concern when it's raised. One is to agree with it and get something done about it. The other is to think that it might be wrong, find out, and if it is wrong, go back to that trainee and explain to him or her why it is wrong. Only then will we begin to get the open culture that we need. We also, I'm afraid, need more honesty. And that means organisational honesty in relation to the harm that is unfortunately sometimes done to patients. We must avoid situations, as happened in this trust, of a consultant being asked to remove criticisms from a report because, and I paraphrase, it would cause extra distress to the family and undue adverse publicity to the trust. So we must learn, have openness so that we can learn from what has gone wrong, so that it can be put right, so that the trust that is beginning to be lost can be maintained and restored. And that we also is the reason why we need more openness. I'm glad to see that it's now accepted that gagging clauses, as they're called, are unenforceable. We must, however, involve both complainants and staff more in the complaints process. And we must make sure that the information, the sorts of stories I've shown you arising from complaints, are shared with the public, with commissioners and regulators, because I think it's those stories that may motivate change. Leadership. These are things that are needed, I think, to strengthen NHS leadership. But we must, I think, ask you, the professionals, the medical professionals, insofar as you're not doing so, to re-engage in the responsibility for your patients by helping to manage the service. I appreciate that perhaps the clinicians have been pushed away a bit. It's time for them to push back, because it is, after all, the clinicians who know the business that the hospital is meant to be providing. I have a number, and I won't go through with these, a number of recommendations to make about caring for the elderly. Although I've given them that label, I would suggest that much of what I've said in those chapters actually is just as relevant to the care in any other ward. And one important point seems to be this, that it is not just the nurse's duty to make sure that a patient has received food and drink. It is the duty of everyone, including, I would suggest, any doctor walking past the bed that sees that that is not happening. And the same goes, of course, for hygiene and cleanliness and the routine matter of observations, many of which I think are not recorded properly, they're either not done, and sometimes, frankly, they are fabricated, and it must be a medical responsibility to stop that happening. Can we please have a situation whereby every patient knows who their doctor, who their nurse is on a shift-by-shift basis, even though there will be a teamwork going on, even though the actual care or treatment may need to be provided by somebody else. Finally, in relation to recommendations, I believe that the professions have a big task to perform in relation to the production of information which would enable people like me to know how not only how a hospital is performing, but how a service within it is performing, and where it's relevant, particular surgeons are performing. The cardiac surgeons have made some progress in this, and I know that some other specialties have as well. But frankly, I'm not interested as a patient in knowing whether the hospital as a whole has a gold star. What I want to know is, if I'm going to have some bypass surgery, will it be performed more successfully where I'm going than it will be somewhere else? If my mother is going into a ward for the elderly, what are her chances of catching a hospital-acquired infection there, as compared with going into another ward or another hospital? And I believe it's for the profession to produce fair measures of the effectiveness of what it is they do. And if they don't, I'm afraid someone else probably will. And the result will be less satisfactory both for the patients and the professions. And that, of course, needs, I'm sure, improvements to our information systems, and I won't go on about that today. So this is what happens in Pennsylvania. I go on the web, and I find out which surgeons would have a black dot, which is a higher than expected mortality. There is another page where they can put comments on why it is they've got a black dot. I did that. Regrettably, most of them seem to suggest it's down to coding. Nearly finally, reaction to risk. In the past, I think we've rather waited for things to be proved to be dangerous. That usually means that someone has died before we do something about it. I believe that, controversial though this is, we have now just seen a change of attitude. It is that if something might be wrong, let's protect the patients by not doing it until we've satisfied ourselves it is safe to proceed. I'm sure that most surgeons do that when actually conducting a particular operation. Shouldn't we begin to conduct our hospitals in the same way? Peer review. All of you know, I think, the power of peer review. I've just demonstrated what it can be. It needs to be embedded in virtually everything that we do, not only by way of regulation, but also by the use by the commissioners and as part of professional development. Finally, can I just leave you with this thought? This is a statement given by Mr. Street. He was the partner of the insulin-dependent diabetic. And he said, I could walk away at any time, but I'm not going to. When they took Jill away from me, they took away my contentment. I don't want anyone else to suffer that. Bereavement comes to us all, but it's how it comes to you that is important. And can I just leave you with that thought? Because it seems to me that we all owe Mr. Street and those who've suffered like him an obligation to do what we can to make sure that others don't suffer as he has. Thank you very much.
We're going to have a discussion at the end, and so can we leave questions until then? Pleasure to welcome our next speaker. Ken Lowndes has had a long career in operational management, including in the airline industry, where safety standards are exemplary, and also as a management consultant specialising in organisational change. He's been involved in the Cure the NHS campaign and put together the blueprint for a new NHS and also wrote the Zero Harm Hospital. He's going to come and speak on behalf of patients and their families. Ken.
Thank you, Mr. President. My Lords, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for inviting me to this important session this afternoon to describe the experiences of patients and their families in what has been the worst disaster in the history of the NHS. There's just one word to describe those experiences, and that's hell. It was hell, it still is hell, and it will remain hell. I'll also tell you a little of what I've been doing to try to bring fundamental change to the NHS, because that's what patients and families need and want. I'll tell you what I'm asking you to do to lead and deliver that change. Hopefully that will mean the NHS will never again make life hell for any patients or their loved ones. And I think that might make the burden just a little easier for those who have had to endure the appalling treatment that was mid-staffs and its aftermath. The fundamental change needed is to ensure that we get to zero harm. And zero harm, of course, includes zero avoidable deaths. And please note that I say zero harm, not zero errors. That will mean all care and treatment are delivered only to the highest standards right first time. So it was hell for the dying, of course, for those badly harmed, and for their loved ones who had to try to protect them. But as if that wasn't bad enough, trying to protect their mums and dads, brothers and sisters, sons and daughters, during their last days and hours from the inhumanity of the staff in Mid-Staff's hospital, fighting the 5-year campaign for the public inquiry for truth, justice and accountability under the banner of Cure the NHS was utterly draining, emotionally and physically, for the members of the group. For the full story of what Julie Bailey, the group's founder, went through during the stay in Mid-Staffs with her mother Bella in 2007, I urge you to read her book, From Ward to Whitehall. For those of us in that group, Robert's first inquiry was bizarre because the sessions were held behind closed doors. But his report was, of course, nothing short of dynamite. A terrible indictment of the whole way the NHS is run from Ward to Whitehall, and that paved the way for the public inquiry. But the NHS has already started to change. And of course, it's always been changing. And over many years, hundreds of dedicated NHS staff have been striving to improve the safety of their patients. But Robert's inquiry showed that in spite of that, we're only at the start of a long and challenging journey into a new NHS, an NHS of zero harm. I gave evidence to the public inquiry, read most of the statements, compiled hundreds of questions for the inquiry's counsel to ask the witnesses, and attended the hearings on perhaps 20 or 30 days, and I found all of that very stressful. I found the constant fight against the Primary Care Trust, the Strategic Health Authority, Monitor, the Royal College of Nursing, CQC, the Department of Health, and of course Andy Burnham himself, very wearing. If Robert had not proved such a calm, determined, but above all an empathetic chairman, it would have been very much worse. Empathetic, that is, to those who had suffered and continued to suffer as they sat and listened to dozens of NHS managers and bosses, local and national politicians, all trying to exculpate themselves. And here I must thank ASGBI and RCS for their support during this difficult time. It's appreciated. But another dreadful element of the whole of the Mid-Staffs hospital disaster, to which Robert's already alluded, is the appalling abuse which Julie Bailey and Cure the NHS members have had to suffer and still suffer. Death threats, desecration of her mother's grave, a constant stream of vile emails, phone calls and tweets are Julie's reward for fighting for truth and justice. And what adds to that feeling of a continuing journey through hell is that utterly and absolutely no senior boss in the NHS has stood down or been sacked over Mid-Staffs. Dozens really should have. So no accountability. No one will now go, and of course, naming specific individuals as guilty was not part of Robert's terms of reference for the public inquiry. I joined Cure the NHS in October 2008 and stayed with the group till February this year. I'd previously had no connection with Mid-Staffs Hospital, but I was so appalled and shocked by what I heard that I knew that I had to help the group. My picture of the NHS had been largely the same as that of most people. In the main, I didn't question the standards of care and treatment, and certainly didn't think the NHS was capable of descending into such depths of inhumanity, dishonesty, and shambolic disorganisation. My chief task in the group was to develop some ideas for radical change, to cure the NHS. And all I could draw on was my own background, and that happened to be in sectors which had well-established systems for safety and quality, and to that I added my experience with a variety of organisations, helping as a management consultant to achieve behaviour change, or culture change as it's often called. The first full set of those ideas was handed over to Andy Burnham in summer 2009, and with some small changes appeared as the Cure the NHS blueprint for a new NHS in the group's closing submission to Robert's public inquiry. That blueprint centres on two fundamental elements. First, we need to turn to that phrase that goes with zero harm, that's right first time. This idea has been well established in many sectors over a long time. It's really an intensification of all the efforts to eliminate errors and to minimise the impact of those which can't be eliminated. Add to that the use of quality control, the standardisation and systemisation of safety and quality across the NHS, and the use of the latest that safety science can offer, and I believe we'll have made a good start. We'll have a framework of safety in which every single NHS patient can experience the same standards wherever they're treated. Currently, there's too much variability. This will see us move into an era in which we no longer need to rely on mortality ratios and other lagging indicators as signs that treatment and care are substandard or unsafe. And secondly, we need a fundamental shift of behaviour by everyone working in the NHS to a set of zero harm behaviours. Or rather than a shift, because every NHS staff member will probably already be using these zero harm behaviours to some extent, perhaps I should say ensuring that they dominate the way everyone does everything for every single patient. That will help to deliver zero harm. So, zero harm, not zero errors, systemising and standardising safety and quality practices, and the universal use of safety science. Secondly, a fundamental shift of behaviours to what I call zero harm behaviours. The zero harm behaviours are designed to meet the shortcomings Robert has identified. A need for candour, openness, fairness, receiving and giving feedback, in fact the whole range of top-class team and communication skills. I explain all of this in a series of videos I've put on YouTube. If you just search for Zero Harm Healthcare, there are 7 short videos, and I go into a lot of detail, which I hope will help to explain all the things that I mean. And I've also developed an app for iPads, and I hope that'll be available very soon. And again, it will hopefully take you through all the essential elements of zero harm. So this is something of what it'll be like. In fact, it should help with that peer review that Robert was talking about. And it really will help you to audit your range of behaviours against the zero harm behaviours for yourself and your team. And it will help you to highlight your strengths and the areas you will need to work on. And then below that, I'll add a lot of tools, exercises that you can help with your team to develop those behaviours. And one of the particularly important ones, of course, is the one that Robert mentioned, which is openness to what your own capability is. A lack of self-awareness was one of the really major problems in surgery at mid-staffs. So that's really the only thing I'm asking you to do, to get started in delivering zero harm right first time in your hospital. The Prime Minister committed himself to zero harm, of course, on the day that Robert delivered his report, the 6th of February this year. And that's why Don Berwick's been invited to help. So the change has started. But preventing avoidable deaths, delivering zero harm, delivering only the highest standards of treatment and care, helping, coaching and supporting your colleagues to do the same will mean hell will never again be something that NHS patients and their loved ones have to suffer. Getting to zero harm will never take away the pain that so many will carry with them from mid-staffs through the rest of their lives, but I hope it will relieve it a little. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. We will now move on to our next speaker. Sir Neil Mackay is steeped in the NHS. He's held most of the senior positions in the NHS since the 1970s, from Chief Executive to Chief Operating Officer. And prior to the implementation of the Health Act on the 1st of April this month, he was Chief Executive Officer of the NHS Midlands and East Strategic Health Authorities, and as such was called upon to chair the joint JCPCT, the Joint Committee of Primary Care Trusts, with responsibility for the safe and sustainable review of children's heart surgery. He cares passionately about the NHS, and with his experience is ideally placed to give the managerial oversight of what happened at mid-staffs. Thank you.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure, a privilege to be here with you today. I'm allotted 10 minutes to give you the managerial response. I will do my best to do that justice. The NHS is a wonderful institution. It's held in high regard. All of the public opinion polls, even in these troubled times, tell us that the NHS is highly regarded by the people who use it, not just in England, but across the UK. It's populated with great people. Some of the brightest in society work within the NHS. We have great clinicians, great leaders, and the NHS does wonderful things. But things can go horribly wrong. Things can go horribly wrong. And I don't need to remind an audience such as this of previous catastrophes, really. The Bristol inquiry. And bear in mind, the Bristol inquiry that Ian Kennedy led reported about 12 years ago, and we're still trying to implement the core messages, the core recommendations that he delivered. Shipman, Allett, Winterbourne, mid-Staffordshire, are all illustrations of how things can go terribly wrong. And things go wrong, in my view, often a handful of core reasons, really. Parts of the NHS forget the core purpose. They chase targets, they chase money, but they forget about the people who they're meant to care for. Things go wrong when a board completely loses sight of its core mission. Things go wrong when patients and the public are not listened to. Things go wrong when there is organisational turbulence, and things also go wrong when clinicians give up and clinicians disengage. Now, there's a constellation of influences that present, I think, a number of risks for the NHS, not just in England, but certainly across the rest of the UK. And they include demographic change, population growth, public expectations, fiscal pressures, and things of that ilk. And I would just say to you that the fact that Robert has done such a brilliant job and produced a great report is not sufficient in itself, because life is risky. There are opportunities for things to go awry again. We need to be very, very vigilant. So what's been done so far? The government, on behalf of the NHS in England, responded pretty quickly and produced a raft of recommendations, or raft of decisions, if you like, for implementation. They included advice about how to prevent problems, the notion of appointing a chief inspector of hospitals, which is due to happen in the not-too-distant future, detecting problems quickly, new regime for inspections as part of that, a statutory duty of candour, a review of complaints are all part of that. Prompt action, making sure that things happen quickly. As Robert said earlier, there were warning signs for Mid-Staffordshire, but they weren't taken seriously. Action did not follow. Ken's made an impassioned point about accountability, and the government has set out its stall about how it intends to see accountability improve. And also, the government has in mind for the NHS in England significant changes in terms of training and motivating staff. Much of it has revolved thus far around what some would argue, the RCN certainly, as a controversy, with people entering the nursing profession in future being required to spend a year as a healthcare assistant. Now, you may think that's a reasonable raft of implementation plans, but my contention is it is not sufficient. What the NHS tends to do when faced with an inquiry and a government response, it gets into action planning mode. Robert has produced 290 recommendations. If we're not careful, we'll have 290 action plans and sub-action plans, and we will lose sight of the whole purpose of trying to make sure that the environment within which we operate and provide for patients and their families is as safe as it possibly can be. So we have to take the national response seriously, but my contention is there needs to be consummately well-developed local responses. I was delighted to be able to listen to David Flume before lunch, his presentation on outcomes. And in some ways, I think I could pause here, and those of you who listened to David, I could just ask you to reflect upon the messages he gave us then, because I agree with just about everything which he said. And it's worth saying also that the response to Robert Francis's report is more than just about clinical outcomes. It's about basic dignity, basic compassion, and basic care. So in my view, locally, we should be encouraging reflection. We should be encouraging a time where people within our organisations think hard about what you want to do locally to improve safety and quality, and have absolutely no truck with denial. This is not a time for people to say, well, it couldn't possibly happen here, or I'm not really going to take this too seriously, it'll wash over within a few months or so. There is no place for denial. Action is necessary. Within organisations, there should be widespread discussions about what needs to be done, and I agree entirely with the views that have been expressed by Robert, by Ken, which I've heard in other parts of this conference. You as surgeons, clinicians in general, need to push hard. You have a professional and moral responsibility to do what you can to help make sure that these kinds of things can't possibly happen again. And boards have a responsibility to make sure that they find ways of engaging their staff, and clinicians in particular, more consummately than ever before. We also need to make sure that we improve relationships with the network, the system of organisations that surround any hospital or trust in England parlance. All too often, in my experience, the organisations that get into trouble are insular. They think they can manage everything themselves. They don't see the need for good relationships with commissioners or neighbouring organisations. They don't understand the importance of clinical networks or engagement with peers. And therefore, I think we need to make sure that that is in the forefront of our minds as well. And we also have to work even harder than ever on open relationships with the public, our patients and their representatives. Good surveillance systems are necessary. We need to make sure that education and training is not just about the technical stuff that makes a good surgeon, but good surgeons also are trained and constantly reminded of the importance of compassion, care, and dignity. We need to recognise that poor performance is as important in terms of reporting and discussing as are the triumphs and successes. And I really do hope in future people within our organisations don't feel the need to ask for permission to do the right thing for patients. As surgeons, as consultants, as clinicians, members of the medical profession, I just believe that you need to do what you know is necessary, And I think there's a risk if you don't, things will be done unto you. I do believe that very much indeed. And finally, I suppose you could summarize all that I've said about what should happen locally as it's about leadership. It's about leadership at board level, from a chief executive and a chair and the board members, leadership within a clinical team from doctors and nurses, leadership from porters and domestic staff. It's about leadership and taking seriously and owning the issues that our patients believe are important. So my call for everyone is to really focus hard along the lines that Robert has recommended, but take local initiatives to ensure that we can provide the safest and highest quality service as a priority for everyone who comes into contact with the NHS. Thank you.
And our final speaker is Lord Kekar, or AJ as he's known to this association through his involvement with the Scientific and Programme Committee. He is a professor of surgery at UCL and a member of the GMC. He was introduced to the House of Lords as a crossbencher in 2010. And I have to tell you, he's one of the most polished speakers in the House, and I suspect at school he probably won the debating prize. So if I can ask AJ to carry on, thank you.
Well, Lord Chairman, thank you very much indeed, and it's a very great privilege to have listened to the three previous speakers and to reflect on what the implications may be for our profession, which I think are profound. But before doing, I must, in tradition of the House of Lords and in the presence of Lord Ribeiro, declare my own interests. I'm a fellow of the Royal College of Surgeons, of course, that was cited in the Francis report, and also recently appointed member of the General Medical Council, also an organisation which has to reflect on issues raised in that report. And I must emphasise that what I'm going to say to you today is a personal reflection rather than the Council's decided view at this time. And I think the implications for us as a profession are profound, but it is really going to depend now in terms of how this all plays out, in how we respond to this important report and all that we've heard. And we need to consider our response in the context of our patients primarily, the public, the healthcare systems that we work in, the political process. These are all vitally important considerations. But ultimately, if our response is one of humility, having demonstrated that we've listened carefully as a profession broadly and understood what the implications of this damning report, the terrible suffering that has been identified in it, are for our profession, for the kind of leadership we provide, for our professionalism, then we can ensure that we move forward in a positive way that allows us all to practice responsibly and effectively for our patients. It also ensures that our profession continues to command the high respect that it does, because ultimately the public understand that our first priority remains and always will be our patients. Now, in thinking about the Francis report, I'm struck actually by something that then Prime Minister Winston Churchill said in February 1942, at the time when Singapore fell suddenly and unexpectedly. It was quite a shocking event, humiliating for the British and Allied forces, and the longer-term consequences for the many tens of thousands of those taken prisoner of war was devastating. But at the time, Churchill asked 4 questions. He asked, why didn't I know? Why didn't my advisors know? Why didn't someone tell me? And why didn't I ask? And I think this is fundamental to the position that we as surgeons in our hospitals face at the moment. Now, we've heard and we all recognise that the healthcare systems in which we work are fundamentally complex now. There are huge pressures and demands, and the system is continuously changing. In addition to that, the patients that we manage have multiple comorbidities and represent in many ways greater challenges in terms of achieving good clinical outcomes than they did some time ago. And in that respect, it's not possible for all of us to have all the knowledge necessary to single-handedly manage our patients. We are dependent upon large teams of expertise, of different types of consultant colleagues, nursing staff, other healthcare practitioners. But those teams ultimately require leadership. I think one of the issues that comes forth time and again is a lack of leadership, both at institutional department levels in a managerial role for clinicians, but also leadership of the environment, the teams that are responsible for the care of our patients. I think one of the important implications from these reports and the surrounding discussions is to ask ourselves the serious question, are we prepared to, are we capable of taking responsibility for patients? Should they be under the care of a named consultant? Should those consultants have the authority to act absolutely in the interest of those patients? And then ultimately, are we prepared to be held accountable for what happens to patients under our care? Now, in the next session, we're going to hear from David Fish, who was Medical Director at Queen Square, the National Hospital for Neurology, and is now the Managing Director of UCL Partners. And he was telling me that at Queen Square, there used to be, year on year, bound folders where patient notes were stored. And those patient notes were stored under the name of the consultant responsible for the care of that patient, not under a hospital number. And indeed, even more recently at Queen Square, there's a large sticker put onto the front of every set of notes for an inpatient, identifying the consultant who is ultimately responsible for the care of that patient. Everything written in those notes is the responsibility of a named consultant. Is that the position that we need to return to? Are we prepared to take that type of responsibility with the authority, but also ultimately being held accountable? We've also heard a lot about leadership, and here I think there is a fundamental question for us. What are the cultures and values that define the profession of surgery today? Do we understand them well enough? Is compassion still at the heart of what defined every surgeon? I remember during my training, I had the privilege of working with some quite exceptional surgeons, technically, intellectually, but every one of them was a deeply compassionate and committed human being who cared more than anything about the dignity of their patients and the patient's overall well-being. Are we in the position to provide that kind of leadership based upon those cultures and values? Are we also in a position to ensure that we once again train to those clear cultures and values, so that one of the greatest responsibilities we have as a profession are to bring on future generations who recognize and understand those values and are able and prepared to apply them effectively for their patients? It's interesting to look at this question of compassion. It's very easy to say it, and it's surprising sometimes that it's not demonstrated in the way that it must be, clearly demonstrated to be the primary purpose, the primary basis upon which we are committed to our patients. It's said that compassion is the oxygen of quality and safety is compassion. So we can move towards systems, quite rightly, of zero harm, of good systems in place which are effective and ensure that the best learnings from the science around improvement and so on are applied in our institutions. But ultimately, nothing will thrive without oxygen, and that oxygen has to be compassion. So ultimately, Lord Chairman, I would say that for our profession, there are profound implications. We need to consider very carefully how we respond not to just small elements of this report, but the entirety of it and what it says to us about medicine in our country today. We need to ask ourselves serious questions about what responsibility we will take for our patients, what leadership we will provide for our institutions, and ultimately whether, above all, we are prepared to put patients at the heart of everything that we do in a compassionate and determined way. Thank you very much indeed.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, we've heard 4 excellent presentations Mr. Francis started out outlining what happened in his review, and in a way, pride in the NHS has created a sense of denial sometimes that things can go wrong, and yet we know that they do. He raised the issue about trainers, and one of them was Turner, who was the SHO. Well, he wasn't actually, he was a senior registrar, been in the NHS a long time, and demonstrated yet again how trainees can often identify, like the pilot in the plane saying, "You're about to fly into the hillside, sir," and the captain takes no notice. We need to listen to our trainees, and I think he made that very clear indeed. And we need perhaps to look at how colleges and others with the GMC can help in the review and visits of hospitals in many ways, as we did before, but this time taking the patient into account rather more so than the trainee. Ken Lowndes, yours was a very passionate and heartfelt, and we spoke earlier, and I know your interest in the airline industry, and the need to go for zero harm is something that we have to take on board and act on. And similarly, I think Neil Mackay was very keen that we should act now, that the government's been quick to respond. You're quite right, there are 290 recommendations. We don't want 290 action points. But it is very important that we, as the doctors, don't wait to be told from on high. There is a problem with the NHS where everybody's waiting for the chief executive of the NHS to tell us what to do. It's in our own hands, and we as consultants have to front up. And finally, AJ, thank you very much for your presentation. Again, I remember a senior consultant saying to me years ago, Bernie, he said, when your name disappears from above the top of the patient's bed, be worried. So I now invite you all, those of you who would like to put questions to the panel, and I know there will be many, please, there are 4 microphones, 2 in the front, 2 in the back. I feel like the airline person, you know. Could you please move to the microphones and address the panel with any questions and concerns? And I think the first one is going to be Mr. Norman Williams, President of the Royal College of Surgeons. Norman.
Thank you, Your Lordship. I've listened with great interest, and I want to say that I believe that the profession is prepared to lead, is showing that it's prepared to lead. Both the Association of Surgeons and the Royal College are out there and are starting to do things. But we must be given the power to do it. That is slowly occurring, but we need to be allowed to set the standards, improve the transparency of the system, and as you, Lord Ribeiro, have quite rightly said, bring back the visits, as long as they're not too cumbersome. I would put it to you, though, panel, and I'd be interested in your response here, that a lot of the criticisms that went on with the pressures that occurred in mid-staffs and are occurring still around the country relate to coercive management styles, which doesn't happen in every trust, but certainly happens still in others, which I don't always blame the management for this because there are significant pressures. But I would say, and I would ask you, first of all, my first question, does the view, should there be an ethical framework for managers? We have the General Medical Council. The nursing profession has the Nursing Council. Should not management have a management ethical framework so that they act on the behalf of patients primarily? I think that's the first thing. The second relates to, and I think you have recommended, Sir Robert, the splitting of the function of the RCN relating to standards on one side and trade union on the other. Is that really compatible these days? And I've seen the response from the nursing profession on this, or the RCN response, and is that appropriate? I'd be interested in your response to those 2 questions.
Well, perhaps Robert, you might start with the last question.
Well, what seemed to me clear from the story of Stafford, and I can only speak from that, was that the Royal College of Nursing showed a conflict between its very necessary role in supporting its members and the other role of actually promoting good professional standards through guidance. And I believe that we suffer in this country from a weakness in the nursing voice. I think if we didn't have that weakness, we'd have a much clearer view, for instance, about how many nurses we actually need to look after our patients. And therefore, I did recommend that they should consider splitting those two functions, because I think then, firstly, I think possibly the representation of the members as employees would be more effective. But I also think that the voice of nursing, which is so essential in the formulation of standards, will be heard more clearly. I note their response. It doesn't appear to me that we're getting very far along that line. I can do no more than make recommendations, but I stand by my recommendation. Shall I go on to the other point? So far as management is concerned, I've made a number of recommendations which I would hope would put the management at leadership level, whether it be clinical or non-clinical, on more of a level playing field. Because it does seem to me that at the moment, management who is not clinical seem to be much less accountable for failures and unprofessional conduct than clinicians. And that cannot be right, and I believe it actually may deter clinicians from stepping forward. And it means that there are different weights in relation to the voices around the table. There clearly should be a more developed form of code of ethics, and I think actually something is being done about that. And I think that we need better training and development for managers and leaders as a whole. And for that reason, I believe we ought to have a staff college. But at the end of the day, you mentioned coercive management being inimical to patients, and of course I would tend to agree. I would agree with that. What I would say, with all due respect to you and your colleagues, is that you do have your professional codes of ethics, you do have your professional accountability, which, although it may sometimes seem a tremendous burden, is actually a tremendous shield as well. And if at the end of the day a manager is coming to you, individually or collectively, and requiring you to do something which is dangerous to your patients, you now have the power to say, no, I will not do that. And in the current climate, I don't know about a few years ago, I would be very surprised if the management will stand up against that.
Thank you.
May I just carry that argument on? Norman used the term coercive management style. And I think everybody is aware that the way the NHS has been structured, it is very much a coercive management style that comes from the top down to the trusts and down to the ward level. Now, I'd be interested, perhaps in Neil's view, as to how the NHS can be changed so that, accepting there has to be value for money, there has to be quality assurance, all of these things we fully accept. But how can we get away from the culture that we all know exists? We know what chief executives are subject to from what used to be the SHAs. And it's easy to see how, in a trust that lacks leadership, this ends up at ward level and with the situation in mid-staffs. What's the future?
It's a fundamentally important point. I wouldn't like any member of this audience to imagine that being the chief executive of an NHS organisation is somehow a meal ticket for life. Someone told me a year or so ago that the average tenure of a chief executive in the National Health Service is less than a football manager in the Premiership. So I mean, accountability does apply. And I take the point entirely about coercion. And in my view, there is no place for that. And if you look at the successful chief executives, successful organisations, they're the ones that find the right balance between being firm and directive where it's necessary, but also find ways of involving clinicians, their patients, their public in a collective sense to deliver their objectives. Coercion can succeed in the short term, but in my experience, those who apply it excessively are found out and join the ranks of those who are like Football League managers. So I do actually think, in addition, that if we can focus on the cultural aspects of Robert's report, the behaviours that need to change, then the opportunity for coercion will become less necessary in the minds of those who currently apply it, and we'll have a far healthier set of NHS organisations than perhaps we have in some places now.
Could we hear from Ken as to what he feels from the patient's point of view?
Well, a few reflections on that. Thank you, Lord Ribeiro. I think it's different training rather than training. There's so much training and leadership training that goes on in the NHS already. For managers, there's a leadership academy. I think we just have to accept, and this is what I mean by the latest that safety science has to offer, the very familiar Jim Reason model of the Swiss cheese and the defences, latent causes and active causes of accidents. In my evidence to Robert's first inquiry, behind closed doors, he didn't give me very much time to speak, I have to say. And I gave him a stream of conscience, in essence, as to why we'd got where we did. And that's that really complex organisations with very different professional groups, and the RCN's been mentioned, but Unison is another very powerful union, and it has no pretense of doing anything about safety, has been another strong political channel in the last decade or more for the NHS. One of the key changes that I saw as soon as I met Jeremy Hunt was that he was the first politician who was really angry about what had happened at Mid-Staffs and was happening elsewhere, and was prepared to spend a lot of time listening to the patient's stories again and again. And really that anger, that empathy, led to the announcement and the way that it was made in the House of Commons on the 6th of February. The government's response to Robert, I think, has heralded a new era. I feel by being here today, I'm in a new era. All that I would say is, I think I have a little bit of difference with Norman's point of view, is that I've been puzzled from the very first time that I met and talked to surgeons, and that was the Royal Society of Medicine about 3 years ago, where I first met Brian Rowlands, which led me to meet Bernie, Norman, and all of you in this association and the Royal College. And I can't quite reconcile the assertiveness that you must have as individuals and as working groups to do the fantastic things that you do, and the way that you feel managers ride roughshod over you and coerce you. I'm sorry, but I don't quite get that. And I think as individuals, as Robert said, and really as a profession, I think you need to push back harder, be more assertive. In essence, cure the NHS through Julie and all the things that we did. We've kind of forced our way into Richmond House and said, look, this has to change, and Robert's been a great ally in that. I think you need to assert a bit more. I hope I understand your profession enough, probably not, but I think you've got to be more assertive in saying, we cannot go through that again, let's be different.
I don't think that's ever been said to a surgical audience before, Ken. Thank you. Mr. Bailey.
Ian Bailey, I'm a consultant surgeon at the University Hospital, Southampton. We need good people as a resource to change the NHS, but we also need enough people. And we need enough people in an environment in which resources are restricted and we have to make some difficult decisions. My father, 25 years ago, wrote a report on the rationalisation of cardiac surgery. Virtually none of the recommendations have yet occurred. Safe and Sustainable came out of Bristol, and it's going round and round the houses. I listened today to a colleague who is very, very engagingly trying to rationalise emergency surgery in Manchester. And that exercise of engagement is met by obstruction. Localisation will not work unless it is allowed and supported by centre and not obstructed. And how is that going to occur?
Can we start with AJ Kako?
Yes, I mean, I think as surgeons we have got to face up to this very, very important issue that there will be a change in the resources that are going to be available. That is defined not by anything other than the position that the nation finds itself in economically and the increasing demands we all recognise will present to the NHS. Where I think we've got to be very careful is to always engage in questions of rationalisation and reorganisation of service with one simple guiding principle, and that is what is in the best interests of our patients. If we have that as our compass, our North Star, then at times we're going to have to take difficult decisions that will be unsatisfactory for us as individuals. But if we're prepared to do that, we may be able to provide an opportunity in which hugely valuable public resources that are dedicated to healthcare are used most effectively for the benefit of our patients. And regrettably, very often, we are seen as the hindrance to some of the important and difficult decisions that have to be taken. And that shouldn't be the case.
Neil, do you want to?
This is a subject close to my heart. I bear the scars of the last year or two with Safe and Sustainable, trying to reorganise services for children with congenital heart disease. There is a national consensus amongst clinicians that we need fewer centres doing more operations. There is a national consensus from patients groups and parents groups that we need to do the same. There is an agreed set nationally of clinical standards. We produce recommendations that suggest that we should reduce the number of centres, and of course we get legal challenges from those emanating from those who are under threat, because people understandably feel very strongly about their local services. So although we have that degree of consensus, it is still difficult to implement the changes. I think, though, unless you've got that clinical consensus and also support from patients' groups, you really are up against it. I'm still optimistic that, for example, Safe and Sustainable, we will find a way through, a way will be found through eventually. But, you know, that has to be for some of these other more local service changes, frankly, political will. Because, in my view, the way in which some of our district general hospitals are configured is unsustainable, and change is necessary. And I say that not because I believe it will necessarily save lots of money, but I do believe strongly it's a powerful means of trying to make sure that services are safer and have a better chance of maintaining high quality in years to come. We can't continue as we are. I mean, the fact that Ian Kennedy reported 12 years ago and we're still trying to implement the core, his core recommendations, I think is scandalous.
Thanks, Neil. I think, though, the issue about reconfiguration is that it is not going to happen 2 years before an election, and that although AJ has said that, you know, this should be patient-centred, we all know it's elected politician-centred. Now, as long as the NHS is run by elected politicians, effectively, this isn't going to work. So I'm just interested to know what anybody thinks the way forward is.
Well, if I can speak again, I mean, I take your point entirely. If there is not, clinicians have the best opportunity to ring these changes. And I think there is added prospect with clinicians in England at the forefront of commissioning in CCGs. It will take some time for them to become mature and strong enough to understand, if you like, their responsibilities. But with the coalition of clinicians and the public, then I live in hope that it will be possible to take these things forward. But you're absolutely right. We cannot ignore the fact that we're run by a political system, and we will continue to be run by a political system for the foreseeable future. But you know, there's a risk in this bit of discussion that we'll all leave this room despairing, and that's exactly one of the points that all of us are saying. We can't despair. We can't stand back and say, well, it's all too difficult. We have to keep fighting for the things that we believe are right for patients.
We have two more questions on Mike for...
Could I just...
Sorry, yes, indeed.
Just make a couple of observations, and it's not that there needs to be a trade union for inquiry chairman, but it's this, that I think in the debate about reconfiguration and all that sort of thing, it is very important. But can I ask you not to use those sort of challenges and problems as a reason not to deploy fundamental standards of safety and effectiveness in what you're doing at the moment? They are actually two different debates. And the other point is this, that if my recommendations and the general approach to information was adopted, I believe that the public, and dare I say it, even the politicians, might actually get to learn that local self-interest in relation to buildings, which is an access, is not necessarily the best thing for themselves. But at the moment, I don't believe there's that sufficient degree of trust. It's felt that a lot of what is said by professionals is a matter of self-interest rather than interest for patients. So that's what needs to change.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm going to try and get two more questions in. John McPhee and then Mike Parker. John.
Thank you very much. I hope we don't have 12 years to wait before your recommendations are instigated either. I'll be brief. I find there is a dichotomy between the recommendation that we all have a duty of candour, which I wholly accept, and the concept of the blame culture. There is inescapably a blame culture in this country. Now, people of my generation are no longer frightened by being accused of blame, but many of our younger colleagues and nurses are. So I want to ask you, in the context of the blame culture, about accountability. I've heard AJ talk about the named consultant above the bed, and I admit that if I am admitted to hospital, I would like to see a named consultant above the bed because I'm familiar with that and I'm comfortable with it, and I know that gives 24-hour care 7 days a week. But in reality, in this day and age, I'm not sure we can apply that. And I need to know that we need to look at outcomes which are based upon teams and that a blame culture does not apply to individuals.
Who would like to start on that one? Ken?
Well, you're getting to the crux of it there, John. And, you know, please don't think because I put on an app and a very simple set of behaviours that getting there is easy. Actually, the behaviours are based on Norman Williams's analysis of what makes surgery unsafe that I took from him when I spoke at the Mid-Staffs workshop in Bournemouth 3 years ago. Now, actually making all of that happen and ensuring that in your particular team and your specialty, your directorate, your hospital, there's not a blame culture. Involves an enormous amount of hard work influencing your peers, your juniors, the managers you work with, that the safest way for the patients is to work in a culture which can be honest and open about errors, about harm, and there's a lot more dialogue to be had on these terms. But that will take loads and loads of sessions, one-to-one, small groups, what I call honesty in action sessions, because, you know, I read in the newspapers all of the time, and there was a case yesterday came out, wasn't there, at a hospital in Surrey, a private hospital, where surgery had been suspended, and you kind of think, hey-ho, here we go again. To get to those sort of pleasant lands where everything is neat and clean and well advised will take a lot of hard work and a lot of discomfort talking through all the difficulties that have happened in the past, the things ignored that shouldn't have been ignored. But it's only you folks in here that can do that through your influencing, and that's why I ask you, please, to make a start on zero harm.
Anybody else want to take that? Right. Okay, we'll move to the last question we made. Mike Parker.
Thank you very much, Lord Rivera. Consultant surgeon recently retired after 43 years of service in the NHS. I use the word service carefully because that's what I believe it was. I agree wholeheartedly with what John McPhee has just been saying. There is an accountability which is necessary for all consultants. And I think through all my life, and certainly the people that taught me, they taught me that accountability because they were professionals.
They taught me that they had to care for the patient, to be there, to pick up the bits after everything went wrong, to do things to the best of one's ability, because you can only do your best. But in the last 15 to 20 years, I have seen a gradual dumbing down of the profession to try and undermine that professionalism. And I firmly believe that that is one, but not all, of the problems that have occurred in mid-staffs. But it's the one which we, as a profession, might possibly be able to do something about. Because if you restore the professionalism, that thing which I saw 45 years ago when I was a student, and have tried to hold on to over all these years, I've seen some who've managed that, and I applaud them. I've seen some who've struggled with it, and I've seen some who've actually been, unfortunately, unable to keep up with it and have given in, and those are the ones who don't engage with the management, who literally go into a little hole and hibernate and just do the job 9 to 5 and then go home. And I've seen it because of some of this coercive behaviour which we hear described. I'm afraid I'd take it further and describe some of it as bullying, and I've witnessed it, and it's not good. And it stops the professionalism. Professionalism will incite excellence and will incite leadership. We would be very pleased to try and restore that. May I ask what the government and the Department of Health will do to help us to restore that professionalism?
Neil, can I ask you to respond first?
When I last had a challenge like that from an audience of doctors, from GPs, I was asked to respond on behalf of the government, and I was asked what I was going to do about nuclear disarmament. I said that it frankly wasn't within my remit at the moment. I think my strongly held view is that government does appreciate the point that you're making. Government appreciates the importance of professionalism, and the government is fully aware of the vital importance of allowing people such as you to have the opportunity to assert yourselves within organisations and within your practice for the best interests of patients. And I think I would also say that I'm not sure you need government to provide the right kind of environment. It would help, I dare say. I'm not quite sure what the help would look like, but I really do believe passionately about the importance of you working closely with your colleagues, with your patients, your public, and your board, your chief executive and your managers, because I think it's possible to create the kind of environment that you're seeking through that means, rather than waiting for some magic wand to be kind of waved by the Prime Minister or the Secretary of State for Health.
Robert, any observations?
Well, I think I agree with that. I don't think I want to comment on what the government's attitude to professionalism is, or if you'll get me on to what its attitude towards the professionalism in my profession is, but that's quite a different department, fortunately. Congratulations, firstly, for 43 years of service, and I think service is the right word, but I do agree that professionalism is something that professionals must promote and espouse for themselves. It will always be under threat by those who are not professionals, whether outside the profession notionally or those within it who let it down. And so I think that professional standards and vocation can only come from within the profession. And I think it can survive whatever depredations of attacks are made on it by way of national training schemes that produce difficulties about contact with trainees and so on. But it's organisations like this, it seems to me, that can promote that. And you know, positive professionalism is surely something that will be welcomed within the provider organisations and those who actually, the organisations delivering healthcare, because at the end of the day, it's going to make the job of delivering the service easier. And the problem comes when professionalism is seen somehow to obstruct things, and I think that's where you need to think very carefully as a professional whether what you're saying is a professional value, or is it a matter of self-interest? Or is it if it's being perceived as self-interest when it's professional value, how do you persuade people that it's one, not the other?
AJ?
I think Mr. Parker's made a very powerful point. But in terms of how this might play out, I think that we are at a time now where a clearly defined, purposeful recommitment to professionalism, spoken loudly by the association and the other organisations and the colleges, will be very welcome. But having taken that position, we will have to be truly professional. We will have to remind ourselves about what the obligations and responsibilities of being professional are, and we will have to use the authority that will be given to us as a result wisely and always focused on the interests of our patients. And if we do that, then from all of this great sadness and pain and suffering, something very important for the future of the NHS and for the future of the privileged careers that we have as surgeons will come.
Ken, last word.
Well, really, I think that's so well said, and I don't think I can or should add to that. That's a great point I would have thought on which to go forward.
No responsibility without accountability, and the reverse is also true. Mr. President.
If I may close the symposium just with perhaps 30 seconds of summary. I think taking what all four speakers have said laterally, I think firstly we must not leave here despondent, and we mustn't also leave here thinking that somebody else is going to sort out this problem for us as a profession. We need to take responsibility. Now, we have the capacity to do that, and I think what I'm saying really is a plea for medical leadership, because if there had been strong medical leadership in mid-staffs, the problem would not have arisen, but there wasn't. It was weak, and indeed it was non-existent. So I think our response should be that, irrespective of government, irrespective of the NHS structures, what we need to do is go away and say, well, we are going to sort this. We're going to sort it ourselves. And if it is that government, and if it is that the leadership in the NHS can help with that, then that's good. But if they don't, we're going to do it anyway. So I think that is where we would like to end. So can I thank all four speakers, Robert for coming to give this excellent summary of his work over several years now, Ken for his insights, Neil for giving us an insight into the way the NHS might approach this, and AJ for the surgical view. Thank you very much all.